if you can force them to say a word or not say a word or put a phrase on their site, okay, or have some shibboleth, okay, then you've invaded their mind. And so it's like digital capture the flag. You are essentially, by virtue of seeing people signal something, by virtue of their virtue signal, okay, you are seeing that you have either at least, even if it's like a gun to the back of an economic gun to the nape of their neck, even if it's under duress, nevertheless, it's still controlled territory.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the thing about this is that flippening is, I don't know if you've ever seen the maps of Imperial Japan at zenith or Nazi Germany at zenith or the Soviet Union at zenith. You never seen those?
No, I've seen 2 of the 3.
Okay, fine. But like there was a period where I was like, oh boy, these guys are really winning a ton of territory. Holy shit, right? And what happened was there effectively was like a bandwagoning counterattack where everybody they'd pissed off ganged up on them and beat them down, right? And so what I think has happened here is the Western establishment, as I mentioned, they've taken on the right, the center left, tech, Russia, China, to some extent India, Israel, and like a bunch of other smaller countries like obviously Iran and Hungary, and they're mad at Britain, half of Britain because it Brexited, and they're mad at France, and they're mad at like various countries on immigration policies. They're mad at lots of countries, right? When you're mad at when you're fighting everyone at once, even if like when this woke just expansion, right? Like this thing just grew to this huge thing. It's kind of like when the Nazis were in 1940, right before Barbarossa, they were at their zenith, right? Imperial Japan was like at the zenith. But now they're really, if they're winning empirically. Okay. And one way is I was actually put my finger on this with the Rogan thing, right? Yes. They were able to grind out a cancellation of Rogan. Okay. Like they ground out a victory, but it took a lot of ammo. It took a ton of ammo. And crucially, there's a big difference between this versus previous cancellations, which is they could only win it like 55-45, not like 95-5. How can you see that? Because they couldn't cancel the people defending Rogan. They were too numerous. Okay? If it's 95-5, then anybody who even speaks up in defense of the person being canceled, after they finish with this guy, then they boom, gang up on that person and gang up on that person. So nobody can even speak up in defense, and everybody gets the signal. They understand how outnumbered they are, right? Yeah. When it's 55-45, they just don't have the numbers to swarm all these different people. There's too many targets to shoot at, and the other guys have troops on their side. And it's really a social war, by the way. That's not a debate. It's not the marketplace of ideas. It's a battlefield of ideas, right? Because there's some ideas which, by their nature, are not about like, the feng shui of an apartment and where you lay out the things where it's all anyone can have this preference or that preference, but they are like monotheism. You have the belief or you don't, right? They're optimized for maximum virality. They're the most mimetic, mind viruses around, like the memes that, Dawkins would talk about, highly fit memes that are meant to spread and then block off the spread of any other competing ideas. They're literally naturally selected for this in our brains, just like computer viruses, these are mind viruses. And you know what the wet market is? It's Twitter. We've all got our brains dunked in a vat, which is Twitter. And so the most contagious possible things are selected for there, right? Where you call them viral, we call them viral, contagious, another word. And so wokeness is one of them, but it's only selected in that environment. And when we change it to an environment of cryptocurrency and pseudonymity, there's lots of roadblocks and stuff that arise, and it makes it harder. Let me give a riff that I haven't given before, which you kind of prompted me to, which is, I think web3 will be Waterloo for wokeness. Okay? Why?
Talk to me about that.
Because, so, Waterloo, it's like a famous thing, Napoleon meeting his Waterloo, right? Which is, this is actually after this powerful army won all these victories, eventually it was defeated, right? And you can argue whether Waterloo's the right analogy or, Napoleon invading Russia and there's a Russian winter and it's terrain that's defeating it. But fundamentally, Web3 is much tougher terrain for wokeness than centralized social media. And here's why, right? First is with pseudonymity, you can reboot under different identities. And so cancellation is not permanent. Also with pseudonymity, I gave this long talk on the pseudonymous economy. Pseudonymity, there's a very strong moral case for pseudonymity because it prevents both cancellation and discrimination. So you don't have to give a single inch on the morality of it, right? If somebody says, oh, we need to count X, Y, and Z group, you can say, actually, I don't want to implicitly discriminate. I don't want to have unconscious bias, because there's a lot of papers on that. You can kind of cite the same science, or quasi-science, whatever. You can argue if it's good science or bad science. If it's bad science, they're not going to be able to cite it. If it's good science, then you can both cite it, right? So you can use the same premises. So the same kinds of stuff that people cite for the purpose of, say, blind auditions, or for ban the box, where you're not supposed to be able to ask about somebody's criminal history, or for not asking about marital status, or not asking about immigration status. I actually agree with some of these things, where some of these things are irrelevant to doing the job, right? Like their immigration status, that's just, a stupid technicality. I mean, of course, you have to go through all the legal paperwork, but that does not affect whether they can calculate an integral or not, right? And so you take that to its conclusion, and you actually have this thing that you can get a left-right coalition on for pseudonymity, and you can make a moral case for it, because that moral foundation is very important. You also have a moral case for decentralization. And what that means is that if a centralized thing is compromised, well, the back end is open state in crypto. That's the thing. It's not just open source. It's open state and open execution. It's not just the code that's public. It's the data set, and you can run a node, and you can watch every single opcode execute. So if you're concerned about a non-transparent algorithm, you can actually see it executing for yourself. What that means is people can't just lock you out completely. If you want to, you could clone the equivalent of the entire backend of Twitter and then do your own chain if you had enough community and so on, right? So that's another check. So pseudonymity is one, decentralization is another. Third is censorship resistance. Like the conventions of the whole space, a huge amount of the whole thing is based on the fact that one person cannot prevent another from doing it, right? Fourth is sort of a built-in anti-establishment thing where the point of Bitcoin and the point of Ethereum is that they're not inflation, right? They're not Wall Street. They are outside it. Now you might say, oh, everything gets co-opted and so on and so forth, but that means the co-opter has to be smart, and those institutions have bled so much talent that they've just gone into cryptocurrency instead, right? Fifth is international. So all these internationals that are piling into Web3. Why? Because if you are in Brazil or India or Nigeria, you're not going to get a visa to the US very easily. You're probably not going to be able to get onto Wall Street, but what you can do? You can boot up on Web3 and start trading. And so there's this massive international constituency for this, which has a lot of intelligent people that have just come online, and they are going to, there's a huge force. I cannot overstate how big that is, right? And so it's a huge army of folks where, the wokes are not, they're used to thinking about it in terms of domestic politics. They're not actually used to thinking about people overseas as anything other than sympathy objects and statistics, I see this with discussion around, China in the 2010s, and now India now. These are actors in their own right? Nigeria is now coming up in terms of the tech scene. South America has now, concepts of its own. El Salvador is going Bitcoin. Lots of South American countries are talking about Bitcoin. Like all these countries are now waking up and doing things other than being, pawns in this kind of great game, right? And so I mentioned decentralization. I mentioned pseudonymity. I mentioned censorship resistance. I mentioned the international. Okay. There's also another interesting aspect, which is the monetizability vanishes if you centralize it. So the entire sort of woke thing is gain control of an organization, then just start looting the treasury. Okay. And it's very similar to any religion becomes a business model, becomes a scam. And it's like John McWhorter and others, many others have talked about wokeness as essentially ultra Protestantism and and look, I'm not anti-Protestant or anti-Catholic or anything like that. I consider myself ecumenical, but a religion that doesn't admit it's a religion or know it's a religion, yet makes moral claims that are at the level of essentially a Christianity fork, And, Tom Holland talks about this in his book. McWhorter talks about this in his book. There's a real parallel, of many things from original sin to, climate change is hell and so on and so forth. Even if you think some of these things have scientific basis, the accumulation of them is not something where, if you think climate change is happening, one answer would be to do nuclear power. But no, instead, it's evidence of how we're sinful and we have sinned and we need to actually destroy industrial civilization and you're a sinner. And it's an argument for social control. And it's like the Puritan mindset of New England. COVID is another excuse for state control and you must submit and all the type of stuff where it's not solved pragmatically. It's solved in a way or quasi-solved in a way that is, state control, right? So if you think of this thing as this religion, well, it's going to have trouble evangelizing here because if it does centralize and control something totally, then the value poof vanishes, right? Because a blockchain, it'll just get marked all the way down to market. It'll get marked down to zero. So you grab it, you centralize it, and then it's like sand through the fingers. What have you grabbed? You grab something which it dissolves if you fully centralize it, right? And that is actually a new thing where you cannot totally capture it and seize it. It's not like seizing an oil field where you have total control over it. If you have total control over it, if all Bitcoin miners were seized, then Bitcoin wouldn't have value, right? And so they would have seized nothing. Now they may still do it. They may try to do it because it's like a political thing and they're spending money on it effectively and they're not trying to make money on it. Russia took a hit of 50% or something to their economy for this invasion. So some people do things that are non-economic. That's actually an important vulnerability. But the defense against that vulnerability is you have so many different chains now, it's going to be hard to take out all of them, right? So you have multiple levels of decentralization. And then you have one thing else, which is very important. And that is that Web3 is sort of splitting the, on the right, it splits the nationalists from the libertarians. On the left, it splits the authoritarians from the libertarian left, right? And what I mean by that is the people who are voting against cryptocurrency are typically on the national security right or the top-down, socialist sympathetic left, right? The nationalists and the socialists are against cryptocurrency, but the libertarian left and libertarian right are for it. And I think there's more ability on both of those sides cumulatively. And so you're starting to see an important split develop on the left on this, where in an important sense, Web3 is outbidding the state. That's to say, it is providing more actual money and community and all of these things than the state's pretense to, provide socialist goodies. It's not actually providing that, but Web3 is, right? So you're finding a lot of people who are redefining socialism as an opt-in Web3 community. I would think of that as the opposite of socialism, okay? But it's one of these funny things where, I have this kind of one-liner. There's a really good thing when both sides feel they're getting a screaming deal. That's the basis for a sustained relationship. You want that. That's actually the opposite of the Justin Trudeau situation or whatever, right? Yeah. Like where both sides feel they're getting a terrible deal, right? But both sides feel they got a great deal. Progressives, finally got a cut of all that tech money. At last, libertarians learned how to share, right? And libertarians, finally got progressives to cut out that state regulation. At last, they learned how to share risk, okay? And, Web3 might just put the world back together again. So that's